Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nick Brule. I'm Senior Project Manager here at the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C. This is all part of a series of programs we're putting together for National Police Week. So you're joining us during Police Week in May. Today, we're going to talk about a relatively new program that is being offered called SAFLEO, which stands for Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers. I just want to provide a few notes as to what's going on here at the memorial. We've engraved 394 names onto the memorial this year. This is a very timely program, given everything that's happening in law enforcement with the civil unrest, with COVID, with the continual stream of negative imagery and scrutiny that law enforcement is coming under right now. And so it's an incredibly stressful time for law enforcement. And unfortunately, sometimes that stress leads to officers taking their own life, which is what this program is designed to educate, create awareness, and hopefully help prevent. So I'd like to introduce two people who are joining me to talk about this topic. Joining us is Kristen Mahoney, who is the Acting Director of the Bureau of Justice Assistance within the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs. She has extensive experience in creating criminal justice policies, programming, and technical assistance across a broad array of law enforcement entities. In 2016, she was recognized for her work on the Violence Reduction Network and awarded the Presidential Rank Award of Meritorious Executive, and that was awarded by President Obama. I hope I got that award name correctly. And then from 2006 to 2012, she served as the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention in Maryland. And prior to that, she was the Chief of the Technical Services Branch of the Baltimore City Police Department, as well as the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice for the City of Baltimore. She received her BA from Sweetbriar College and her JD from the University of Baltimore. And she is a member of the Maryland Bar and has practiced with the Legal Aid Bureau of Maryland, specializing in representing abused and neglected children. So thank you very much for joining us, Director Mahoney, and for your impressive resume. Also joining us is Brandon Post. Brandon is a Senior Research Associate with the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, or commonly referred to as IIR. Brandon is the project leader of the SAFLEO program. Prior to joining the SAFLEO program in IIR, Brandon served as a captain with the Provo Police Department in Utah. He was instrumental in the design and creation of a comprehensive officer safety and wellness program within that entity. And throughout his extensive career, Brandon has served in different assignments, from being a defensive tactics instructor, a firearms instructor, as well as a public information officer. And he served for 15 years on a multi-jurisdictional SWAT unit. So Captain Post, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. Director Mahoney, if I could, let me begin with you. And if you could just tell us about SAFLEO, how it began, and what the program offers.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I want to first acknowledge my team who work tirelessly on this initiative with you all, Deborah Meter and Vince Davenport. I also want to thank the National Law Enforcement Memorial Museum for having us here during National Police Week, and for continuing to recognize the importance of having a national conversation about law enforcement wellness and suicide. Our mission is to achieve safer communities by supporting our local, state, tribal, and territorial law enforcement. And we accomplish that part of our mission through our VALOR Safety, Officer Safety and Wellness Initiative, which addresses all topics related to officer safety, wellness, resilience, and performance. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our SAFLEO program, which is the National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program. I will never forget attending a meeting on officer suicide hosted by the New York City Police Department and the Police Executive Research Forum back in 2018, 2019. back then and even now, NYPD is not unlike other agencies and facing enormous challenges with officer suicides. Many departments have devoted tremendous energy and resources to addressing the problem. And that day was the first time I heard so many people come together in the auditorium of the NYPD talking about this openly and honestly. After that meeting, the Police Executive Research Forum released an incredibly important report entitled An Occupational Risk: What Every Police Agency Should Do to Prevent Suicide Among Its Officers. And they recommended that law enforcement leaders make employees' mental health care a priority and provide robust officer wellness programming. Many of you were at that meeting and you've made this issue your personal and professional priority, and that's why we're here today. So I want to thank you for that. The need for such programs obviously have increased dramatically over the past 11 months. We honor heroes like Howard Liebengood, a United States Capitol police officer who responded to the attack on our Capitol, who died by suicide 3 days later, and so many others. So BJA created the SAFLEO program in partnership with the Institute for Intergovernmental Research and its partners, the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum, the American Association of Suicidology, and the Major City Chiefs Association. Together, we're bringing field training, technical assistance, and a multitude of resources together in one place for law enforcement agencies that are based on research, analysis, and proven promising practices. And this is all designed using the most current adult learning strategies, bringing innovative and creative teaching and materials to encourage behavior change and the implementation of a culture of wellness and safety. SAFLEO came into being because we recognize that our nation's officers have a high degree of exposure to stress and trauma. And unfortunately, because of this, officers seem to have a higher prevalence of suicidal ideation. The SAFLEO program's purpose is to stop that trend and provide meaningful support and resources to our law enforcement officers. We have found that a drastic change needs to happen in how we address officer wellness and suicide. Like that day at the NYPD, we need to constantly have open dialogue and create and encourage a culture within the law enforcement where talking about wellness and asking for help is okay. And that's what we're doing through SAFLEO. The SAFLEO's programs include a suite of in-person and online training and technical assistance for law enforcement that is provided at no cost. It's focused on education, awareness, recognition, and prevention of law enforcement suicide. There is a lot there, all focused on helping agencies, helping officers, helping law enforcement family members and friends bring awareness and hopefully prevent a future officer suicide. I'm really proud of this initiative. Deborah and Vince have worked really hard at it with you all, and we hope everyone takes advantage of it as much as they need to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. And you touched on the U.S. Capitol, and there have been some more high-profile cases that I think a lot of us believe are associated with the stress and the trauma that officers experience. There have been some issues or instances of officers using social media to discuss and share their feelings, and I think some of that ideation before actually carrying it out. Some very tragic examples of officers who may be reluctant to come forward or don't know who to turn to for help. I'd like to turn now, if I could, to Brandon, to Brandon. And if you could talk about the impact of a suicide on an agency and you know, what we can do to help prevent this and talk about what an executive might need to prepare for when we're talking about that. And if I can, before you answer, Brandon, I'll just frame again, I keep using the term frame the issue, but in 2019, there were almost 230 recorded law enforcement suicides. There were 139 line of duty deaths. So it's sort of been estimated that the rate of suicide among law enforcement officers is somewhat close to twice that of the line of duty deaths. Now, that's not a hard statistic, but it sort of gives you that framework to operate from and how serious this problem is. Brandon.
Yeah, first, thanks for having me today. But obviously, losing an officer to suicide, I mean, that could be devastating for a department. And if we look at those who are impacted by this, I mean, it impacts the department, individual officers, especially those who are close to the officer who's deceased, agency operations, and especially the officer's family. Now, losing an officer to suicide is extraordinarily difficult because it's not something we typically prepare for. I mean, we recognize that this is a very dangerous profession and that we can lose an officer in the line of duty. And we have policies and procedures in place in case that terrible event ever occurs. However, not nearly as many of us have a policy or procedure in place in case we lose an officer to suicide, which is unfortunate because, as you just said, statistically speaking, we are more likely to lose an officer to suicide than we are to lose one to a line of duty death. And it's important to be prepared for this possibility because dealing with the tragic loss of an officer, that's incredibly difficult, and making necessary decisions in the immediate aftermath of a suicide, that can be overwhelming because there are some very difficult questions that are going to need to be answered. For example, are death notifications different for suicides? How does the leader address the media? Will the funeral protocol be different? How's the department going to care for the deceased officer's family? Should there be a departmental debrief? And probably one of the most important questions we need to ask, is there a potential danger of contagion where other officers may die by suicide? Now, it's easier to make these critical decisions when not dealing with the emotional storm associated with a suicide. And having a protocol in place to respond to law enforcement suicide, that can assist in minimizing the added pain toward loved ones, colleagues, and the department. And that goes along. The SAFLEO program has just recently published a Postvention suicide guide to help departments prepare for this tragedy should it ever occur.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brandon. And that was very well said. And you made that important distinction between a line of duty death and a suicide, and what becomes a quandary for a chief or an executive as to how to approach that. And at the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum, we brought in some subject matter experts who are guys who serve on honor guards. And those are really the good guys to talk to about how to approach some of the ceremonial aspects of this. But we also had a huge team come together and put that Postvention guide together, which is really a guidebook to help executives and departments work their way through an officer suicide and ask those questions, hopefully in advance, to your point, in advance, so you know how you're going to approach and handle this and get you to think about all that. Director Mahoney, if I could, we talked a little bit about one of the key elements that's already been produced, which is the Postvention guide, which is available now. You can download it and begin looking at it. But can you talk us through a little bit about the trainings and the levels that are offered so you can sort of demonstrate how SAFLEO is being rolled out?
Sure, thanks. So we feel like our training needs to address executive, supervisor, and line officer. So often I go to some of the trainings that we have, and it's a lot of line officers that are there. And I think, gosh, they're getting some really good information. But, they go back to their home agency, and the first thing that happens is their sergeant says, well, I don't care what you learned at that training. That's just not how we do it here. And so I think for our training to be effective, we've got to make sure we instill executive training and supervisor training and line officer training. Everybody's got to be on the same page. And so SAFLEO, it's a really important part within our VALOR Initiative's 13 programs. It naturally fits within VALOR's initiative's mission. I'm glad that we were able to expand VALOR and make officer suicide prevention part of our officer safety, wellness, resilience, and performance. It just makes sense. Our trainings under this program use a comprehensive approach that focus on occupational risks and strengthening support from law enforcement agencies, colleagues, families, and friends. And like I said, to be truly comprehensive, these trainings have to address all of these factors, but how those factors differ for an executive, a supervisor, and a line officer, but also how they're all connected together. So we've designed SAFLEO in a way that focuses individually on these different factors, but also ties them together to build a culture of support from inside and outside of an agency. So we have many resources, and we have the ability to develop new resources. So for folks that are watching this and they go onto our site and they look at our inventory of resources and they think, I think they're really missing this particular element, or they should do something separate on this element. We're open to that. We develop our initiatives with the field and for the field, and we've strategically designed this program to address these issues, but we don't know everything. And we don't want, what I do know is that we would like to end the idea that seeing suicide is the only way out. We want to be able to show officers and members of a police agency and sheriff's department that this isn't the case and they're not alone. We want law enforcement to be well and to be safe. And we want them to feel and know that they can ask for help and that they won't be alone in getting help. And I think that VALOR is really great and has done a wonderful job in expanding its scope to address this critical issue.
Absolutely. And you mentioned culture of support, and that ties into what we here at the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum are constantly saying through our officer safety and wellness programs, not only a culture of support, but a culture of safety, as we try and deal with an array of safety issues and wellness issues across law enforcement. And so it's very critical that I particularly think during this time now, and I'm not trying to pontificate, but we're at a turning point here in law enforcement, I think, with everything that's going on, that this is really important. Brandon, can you talk a little bit about the difficulty of officers seeking help? And we already kind of mentioned the Postvention guide. If you want to talk a little bit more about that, you can. But can you just take us through how important it is for us in law enforcement? And I don't know if I mentioned or not, I'm retired from 25 years in the DC Police Department, and certainly know that when I was on the police department, it was just the stiff upper lip and really not a whole lot more. There were mandatory sessions after a traumatic event, but none of what we do now existed when I was doing it. So can you talk about a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. I mean, the SAFLEO program and other programs like it, they're crucial because, as we keep reiterating the point, but it's an important point, they're crucial because we know that we lose more officers to suicide than assaults and traffic accidents combined every year. Now, that fact alone should mandate a call to action on the part of our profession to provide meaningful support and resources to our officers. I mean, the SAFLEO mission is to heighten the awareness of this problem and prevent officer deaths by suicide. And you kind of mentioned a bit about the stigma or the culture we have against reaching out and asking for help. And it's interesting you bring that up because just recently I participated in a web event where we had a clinical psychologist who has literally dealt with thousands of officers over the course of his career. And he said one commonality that he sees over and over is that officers are more worried about people finding out they asked for help than they are about getting well. And then that web event also featured an officer who had been involved in an extraordinary critical event. And she found herself rolling around on the ground, fighting with a man twice her size who had pulled out a gun and was trying to kill her. Now, she stayed in the fight, ends up getting, she gets shot in the face during the incident. But in the aftermath, where she's healing from some pretty significant physical, emotional, and mental injuries, she realizes that she's struggling with suicidal ideation. And the statement she made was that reaching out and asking for help and admitting that she was suicidal, that was more frightening than the critical incident itself. I think we need to think about those two statements for just a minute. I mean, that's extraordinary. We have a definite stigma in this profession against reaching out and asking for help and taking care of ourselves. We've got some real work to do to change this. Because in this profession, we are constantly exposed to things that are outside the bounds of normal human experience. And it is normal human behavior to be bothered by some of the things we see and experience each day. We strongly believe that those who reach out and ask for help in processing some of these critical events that they've experienced that those people are courageous and that there's a demonstration of strength there. It's not weakness by any means to take care of yourself and ask for help in processing some of these things.
That's absolutely true. And it's so important that officers do feel the ability to do that and don't feel that stigma that we've talked about. Some agencies have made tremendous strides in this with their wellness programs, keeping offices open where there's a very relaxed atmosphere where you can come in and talk about things, where there are peer mentoring programs that are very successful, as well as agencies recognizing the need and putting things in place. The SAFLEO program is going to, I think, provide a lot of important steps for agencies to take. And I'm a big believer in first line supervision. I believe that in the military, the NCOs seem to make sure everything runs right. And certainly in my experience, the street level sergeant with the patrol officers, making sure that he's got his people under control and I don't mean to say under control, but knows what his people are up to, and he or she, and knows what's going on, I think is really critical. And there is, as the director mentioned, there is a first line component to the training of SAFLEO. So I think that's really, really important. And again, the post-event guide is available, and you can go to www.valor4blue or just type SAFLEO into your browser, and you can find that guide and download it. And then definitely look for those trainings that are going to be available in the future so that you can get your agency involved in the training that's going to be offered. It's very comprehensive, and it deals with all of these issues as well as recognizing the dark path that officers may take and all of the things that may lead to it that we all need to be aware of. So I want to thank you both for joining us today and for helping us here at the Memorial Fund participate in this and push SAFLEO out even further to make sure that people are aware of it. And I would encourage everyone to visit either valor4blue.org, or if you would visit our website for the Memorial Fund, and there will be a link to that panel discussion that will take you through not only some of the things we've already discussed here, but also help you understand that Postvention guide, which I think is so critical for agencies to have and have it as a tool. So when the time comes, if it does come, you're prepared and you have this as a very strong reference to help guide you through that very difficult process. So again, thank you both for joining me. Any last thoughts, or is everybody good?
Good.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Be safe.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And everyone watching, be safe and understand that in October will be a hopefully in-person police week. We are presenting a number of virtual offerings here at the Memorial and Museum for this May that we'd like you to tune into, of course, this being one of them. But in October, the 10th through the 14th, I believe we are going to have our standard candlelight vigil, as well as the COPS ceremony and the FOP ceremony, all of those things that we are used to during Police Week, we are working to put together for October when we can all be together in person. Thank you all.
Welcome. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining our session today. Today, we're going to be talking about law enforcement suicide. My name is Deborah Meter, and I am a policy advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance with the U.S. Department of Justice. At BJA, I have the great privilege and honor of leading our officer safety and wellness portfolio. Officer safety and wellness has been a priority for the Department of Justice and for the Bureau of Justice for many years now, and will continue to be so. Unfortunately, we're seeing the continued need for us to address law enforcement suicide. With that in mind, the Bureau of Justice Assistance created our National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program. This program provides training and technical assistance and resources at no cost to your agencies. So I encourage you all, please, to visit the website at www.SAFLEO, that's SAFLEO.org. On there, you'll be able to see the many resources that we have available and learn about the training that you can request through the SAFLEO.org website. One of the newest resources that we have available through SAFLEO, and something we are announcing today, I'm very excited to announce, is the release of our post-event response guide. This is a guide that we have pulled together to assist your agencies should your agency ever encounter a law enforcement suicide. We certainly hope that you will never ever need to use this resource, but we understand the need to have one available. We have brought together on this panel, distinguished panel, many subject matter experts in the field of law enforcement suicide. These are also representatives of the agencies and the organizations that partner with us. So I would certainly like to thank those agencies, and those are the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, who is our partner on SAFLEO, along with the American Association of Suicidology, our Major City Chiefs Association, and the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum. You're going to hear from representatives from those organizations today. They'll be providing you critical information, talking about the guide and what you will be able to access from that guide. So we look forward to providing that to you. I hope you find it useful. And again, I hope it's something that you never ever have to use, but know that it's available. Lastly, I want to thank you all for all of the sacrifices that you do, that you make in keeping our community safe. BJA recognizes the challenges that you all face as you go about your day-to-day duties to help keep our community safe. And we are here to support you in any way that we can. Thank you very much. I hope you stay well. I hope you stay safe. And I appreciate everything that you do. With that, I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Chief John Bouthelette.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for those gracious opening remarks. Again, my name is John Bouthelette. I am the retired Chief of Police from a municipal police department in South Urban, New Jersey. I am also a lead program advisor and instructor with the National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program that was developed through the BJA. Now, this presentation, this workshop, is designed to give you an overview of the contents of that Officer Suicide Post-Event Guide. And again, falling under the concept of the National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program, which we'll hear me say a lot of times is SAFLEO, S-A-F-L-E-O. Now, when an officer dies by suicide, as an agency, you're often left with a lot of difficult questions you have to ask. It's just extremely complicated, from how you deal with the scene, how you message this event with your people, how do you message this event with the officers' families, how you message this event with the community. We also have to figure out how we're going to do this funeral, how we honor the life, the loss, and much more involved in this process. So even though the SAFLEO program is strictly about prevention, we would be remiss if we did not talk about this reality, this possibility that you may encounter in your agencies. So this is something, as Deborah Meter said, this is something that we hope that you never, ever, ever have to use. But if a suicide does occur within your organization, we want you to be prepared. Your department's response to a death by suicide will have a long-term impact on your organization and all of its members. And that's why this is so important. Now, again, our first goal always has to be prevention and mitigating suicide in any form, any way, any chance we get. But realistically, obtaining such a goal is difficult in a profession where witnessing death and human misery is commonplace. Given the realities of this profession, we need to talk and work together to prevent other law enforcement deaths from occurring as a result of law enforcement suicide. So that's the goal. That's been the goal of the SAFLEO program. But we are going to tell you and make sure you understand by the time we're done with this workshop that as an agency, you need to develop caring and thoughtful post-event policies that can help achieve the goal of what we call postvention. That's the why behind this post-response guide. Now, let me kind of give you a quick agenda how this is going to look today. First, we are going to give you a quick overview of the guide itself. We're going to carry this everywhere from response to the scene to notifications, funeral protocols, postvention, and at the end, we're going to talk about the resources that we can make available to you as not part of this guide, but as part of the overall BGA National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program. So in order to get started today, I presented a word already in my opening, and the word I use is postvention. And some of you might be looking at me like, oh, what does that mean? So what I want to do is I'm going to bring our panel up, and let me introduce our panel first, just so you understand who we have. Everyone on this panel is a contributor or reviewer, myself included, to this guide. So today we'll be talking to Deputy Chief Eric Kazmierzak from the Tucson, Arizona Police Department, Dr. Julie Sorrell from the American Association of Suicidology, and Mr. Nick Bruhl from the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum, and he's also a retired Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer. So that's our group. So let me start today. Let's get this going. You've heard enough from me. And I'm going to go to you, Julie, on my first question, because I introduced a term that I want to make sure people understand, and that term is postvention. And you and I have talked about this word postvention. What do we mean when we talk about the concept of postvention?
Postvention is a really funny term because essentially it was made up by Ed Schneiderman, who people refer to as the father of modern suicidology. And he made up a lot of words. But postvention is anything that happens after a suicide takes place. And the idea is that it's post-intervention, so the intervention couldn't have happened, but postvention becomes prevention for the next generation. So what we do in the hours and minutes and days and months after a suicide can really help change the course of what happens for the entire time afterwards. And that's why it's referred to as postvention.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important topic that we talk about today. And we'll come back and revisit that. And there's a couple other things that we're going to talk about that are associated. There are a couple other things that are associated with postvention that I'll make sure that we cover as well further on during this conversation. So that kind of takes us to, if everybody understands what postvention is, post-traumatic growth, and we'll get to that as well. What we want to do is to start from the beginning. Okay, and the beginning is that your agency experiences an officer suicide. With that being said, I want to bring in Eric, the Deputy Chief from Tucson, Arizona, to kind of talk to us about what that looks like. That initial beginning, that initial response to the scene. And Eric, that's going to be chaotic. I think about how many times I've investigated suicides in my career, but there's been one factor that's always been missing. That's my personal connection to the person. But in officer suicide, we have that personal connection. So that means doing it right matters. So let's kind of talk through the process of how we get it done right and how your agency's been doing that, getting it done right the first time, responding to these horrific scenes.
Thanks, John. And first off, I just want to thank you for inviting me to join you and Nick and Julie in this discussion. You know, the fact that we're having this talk today and presenting this material today really highlights something that I know is going to be a theme throughout this conversation, which is the fact that, you know, we need to remove the stigma associated to topics like this in our profession. And as Chief Ed Rossler from Fairfax has said many times, that it's to understand that it's okay to not be okay, that it's okay to ask for help. And I know there are agencies out there like the agency that I work for, the Tucson Police Department, where work is being done to address officer wellness and mental health and suicide prevention. And I want to thank those agencies and recognize them for putting wellness at the forefront. And I know this is a tough topic, and if your agency is not as far along maybe in addressing these things, I want to challenge you today to start now, because there's never been a more important time in our careers to do so. As you mentioned, you know, I'd like to start by sharing my thoughts on agency response to a scene like this. It's undoubtedly going to be chaotic, emotional. It's going to be a traumatic event. And what I'd like to do, I think, John, is as you've mentioned already, take this in a chronological sense. You know, after all, we as police officers, that's how we think and we process through planning incidents like this. and like what we're discussing here today. So let's jump in. One of the first notification mechanisms that we're going to get, that we may get, is of a suicide event involving one of an agency's officers, is potentially through the 911 or the dispatch system. And it's because of that I think that dispatch system or that 911 center should be a part of the planning process when you're putting together your protocols and your policies for how to handle an event. If they're going to be the first point of contact, I think there's some interesting and important questions that you should ask yourself during this planning process. How's that dispatch center going to handle the call? Is that call something that's going to get routed to fire or EMS first, maybe? What information does the caller provide to the dispatch center? How are they going to dispatch that call, and what details might be put over the radio? Because how that 911 center handles the call and what information goes out is going to be critical in determining the momentum of the response, of the law enforcement response. And this is really an easy step to overlook for many police departments, especially if you're like the Tucson Police Department, where your dispatch center is not part of the police department, or their dispatch operation is something that you contract out with another agency. One other thing to remember in the dispatch protocols is many police departments, and this is the case here in Tucson, have frequencies, radio frequencies, that are monitored by local news media or social media based notification sites. So by all means, be cognizant of what information is going out over that radio frequency so that you're not inadvertently releasing sensitive information. And we're going to talk about confidentiality here in a minute. And the last piece on the dispatch topic is as you're moving through this planning, and I mean, I know this is going to come up later in the conversation today, but don't overlook that 911 staff when it comes to offering counseling services in the days and the weeks that follow this incident, because remember, at the end of the day, they've experienced a traumatic event as well. And as we move along through this chronology, you have now officers responding to the scene, and they're arriving at the scene. And we all know as law enforcement professionals what it's like to have responded to a suicide event. You alluded to it yourself. I can certainly remember many of those incidents even today. And those incidents were involving folks that I didn't even know. But what we have to recognize and we have to acknowledge is the potential for that emotion and that turmoil to be thrust upon the responding officers if they know the person that's involved or they've worked with them. And I'll take a quote from the guide, John, because it says it well. Critical decisions can be compromised by officers who become personally and emotionally engulfed based on the totality of the circumstances they encounter. And recognizing that and understanding how to deal with that during the event will be important in the professionalism and the investigation of an incident like that. So for food for thought there, be cognizant that this turmoil may be on the shoulders of the responding officers, and rotate those officers out, or potentially ask for another agency to assist in the response. As we talk about the investigation and as we move through that, by all means, follow your agency's protocols and policies with respect to death investigations. Don't abandon those policies and protocols because of the emotion that you're going to feel and the emotion that you're going to be going through in this event. The safety and security of the scene and the preservation of evidence may prove to be important at a later date. So please be mindful of that. And know that in the following days, the officer's family and friends that are surrounding may have questions for the agency about what happened and what they found in the investigation. So having conducted a thorough and professional investigation will allow your agency to answer many of those questions and help the family work through those questions. In terms of scene oversight, some questions that you might want to think about. What are your incident command protocols, and do those protocols transfer over to a situation like this? Is the on-scene supervisor going to remain that incident commander, or is the commander or an executive level officer going to come in and assume that role? Is there somebody that's present at the scene that can act as the immediate family liaison and responsible for that chain of communication back and forth between the department before that role is handed over to somebody more familiar with the topic? Most of all, having a solid continuity of command is really going to be important as you work through this emotional time. Now that you've responded to the scene, you've got your command structure in place, and it's safe and secure. It's time to begin thinking about the process of notifications. And this is going to have to happen both internally with the officers within your department and externally if, for instance, the next of kin hasn't been notified or isn't present at the scene, or you start to get media inquiries. And there's this other complicating factor that we happen to live in the social media age, and we'll touch on that here in a minute. But first and foremost, as I said earlier, have a plan that you can fall back on, because in the throes of the emotion of responding to the scene, it's not the time to start thinking about the notification tree and trying to figure that out. So having a plan in place will allow that to flow smoothly and allow accurate information to be disseminated to the right people. Remember back to those critical incidents that you've responded to or you've been involved in. You're sitting there on the scene, you're trying to answer questions, you're trying to make a phone call to make notifications, you're trying to keep abreast of the situation that's going on at hand. And that's a challenging set of circumstances. I know, and I've been there, and it's tough. And just remember, if you're that initial officer on scene or you're that initial supervisor on scene, you control those notifications. And those notifications, if done appropriately, can be helpful for everyone as this incident unfolds. I talked about confidentiality earlier, and I just really want to emphasize that it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be something that you're going to want to talk about this. You're going to want to, in the initial response, you're going to have this desire to make sure that the folks that knew this officer are aware of this situation. But confidentiality needs to be held at the highest level, and it's your responsibility to conduct this investigation professionally, and that comes with we owe it to that family to maintain confidentiality as best we can.
Eric, I think that's, can I stop you for a second? I think that's so important because you and I had a conversation about this already. How to keep that scene as professional as possible, because you shared a story with me about, families have a difficult time accepting this, don't they?
Yes. Yeah. The fact of the matter is there is going to be a time when the family wants to question the reality of this being a suicide. And they're going to want to ask questions about the investigation. They're going to want to know what the police department did. They're going to want to know what happened. And having conducted a thorough investigation, having followed all of those policies and protocols that you have in place for death investigations, is going to allow the agency to respond to those questions in a meaningful and factual way, and help that family really begin that healing process and help them work through that cycle that they're gonna find themselves in.
And I think that goes back to the concept that you only get one chance to get this right. And the second thing, this isn't about you, right? This is about so much more than you.
You mentioned you only get one chance to get this right, and talking specifically about next of kin notifications. I've had the unfortunate responsibility of having to present the flag at more than one retired officer's funeral, and that's a challenge. That's a really hard position to be in. And my advice, and it's simple, in a situation where you're going to have to be the one that notifies the next of kin, it's be human. Every one of those instances where I've had to present a flag, I've never left with a dry eye. Never once have I left with a dry eye. And the simple act of being human in that moment made all the difference in the world for both me and the family. And you're right, you never get a chance to do that over again. And I would say, be human in that moment. Understand the grief they're going through, and be human.
And our guide gives recommendations on wording, locations where you should be doing that. So I think it's important that when people get this guide, they kind of look at those recommendations as well. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but keep on going, Eric. Oh,
no, that's fine. Yeah, no, it's those recommendations are definitely in that guide, and there's several appendix to talk about that. Another point on the notification process is this notification form. I think it's in Appendix D in the guide. If you don't have that within your agency, I would encourage you to think about the implications that has on the mentality of the officers that you're going to ask to fill that out, and really put some thought into carefully messaging the rollout of that form and its implementation. And again, I can't harp on it enough. Really pay attention to maintaining the confidentiality of that form and the information that's contained in there. A note real quick before we move on, John, on the social media point, we all know how impossible it is to control social media, to control the messaging that's going out on social media. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, and you've already mentioned it a couple of times, but really, really, really important to have a well thought out plan for how you're going to release information publicly, whether it's to elected officials or to the media. It's really important for your agency to have a good internal social media policy. If you don't have one of those, I would encourage you as part of this process to think about that. And there are plenty of good examples out there, whether it's through major city chiefs or through PERF, to get those social media policies. Then the last point I'll make, John, is on staffing. This is going to be a critical event for any agency, no matter your size. You're going to be dealing with grief and emotion of the loss of an officer, but the reality of our profession is that those 911 calls are going to continue to come in. You're still going to have to answer the 911 calls that come in. And unfortunately, with 23 years on the police department here, I've attended quite a few funerals, and I know that in every instance, there in the background, there's planning and preparation going on to maintain the continuity of operations so that we can answer those 911 calls. So think about that. You either have a plan in place to backfill officers or have an agreement with another agency to support your operations, but that's going to be really important. So just to wrap up, John, if you have psychological services or peer support or a department chaplain or similar support mechanisms, consider their role early in this process. They're going to help and be critical for the family to work through that initial grief that they're going to feel and start on that path of healing. And I just want to make sure everybody knows, always be professional, be human, maintain that confidentiality, and know that with a loss of a loved one, or with a loss of a coworker, emotions are going to run high. Because of that and all of the complexities that are associated to that, begin having these conversations today. Begin having this conversation about the plan. Have a plan, and by all means, follow it.
And I think that's key, have a plan. And that was why we developed this guide, right? To help you establish that plan. We try to make this as one size fits all as humanly possible. So it's expandable and contractable based on the size of your agency. But, without a plan, we have nothing. We have nothing. And Eric, you covered so much in such a short period of time. So when I want for people to understand in this workshop is there's so much more in the guide, but Eric, you did a fantastic job. And you basically covered the first couple of hours in this ordeal, right? This is the first couple of hours, ladies and gentlemen, of this ordeal. You have a long way to go past where Eric has talked about. Because the next thing, Eric, once you get that all straightened out, we have our proverbial ducks in a row about the scene. We investigated it well. We followed the plan. We're doing our notifications. We're working hard on confidentiality. All those things, dealing with the social media, all that's going into play. We have to move now to a next phase. And I'm going to bring in Nick Brule for that. And the next phase of this is we got the investigation done. We got all that done, but how do we honor the loss? And this one, Nick, is something that we talk about all the time. My fellow chiefs who are still active, retired, that I talk with, and as with all ceremonial events, when we talk about this isn't about you. Just like the investigation is not about you, honoring a loss is not about you. But when it comes to honoring the loss of a death by suicide, it gets complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And as the chief mentioned, there's a lot of emotion involved in this. And I have to echo the thing that we've already sort of created a drumbeat here on, and that is a plan. Don't be caught with this happening and not having thought the matter through a little bit. And this guide, it's not a playbook, but it certainly is a very strong guide to help you as a chief or as an executive think through and ask the questions you need to ask in order to assist the family of that member as well as your agency honor this individual. And that can be a very difficult thing. And there are a lot of important questions that have to be asked. One of the things that I think agencies have to consider, first and foremost, you've got to respect the family's wishes. And it's very important that you work with the family and that the family understands what possibilities are there in terms of how their loved one can be honored following a suicide. And that also leads to some questions that you yourself as a chief or an executive have to ask in terms of what level or in what manner your agency is going to honor this individual. There's one tool that has been suggested, and that is it's called by a number of different names, but a death care packet. Now, on my agency, we always had that form you had to fill out that had your next of kin notifications. And I think mine asked me what my religion was. But how about if your agency actually asked that individual what their final wishes might be, or at least having that important information to pull up, if it's ever needed, what their religion is, if there are any important points of contact for services that they might wish, anything like that that can be pre-prepared, and I know this, I get it. I know people are listening to this and going, boy, that's awfully macabre. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be practical, and it's meant to really assist the agencies with preparing for these sad events. The other thing to consider is as you're dealing with the family, is you want to consider and ask yourself the questions about this individual. If this is a 24-year veteran who with a stellar record, you might be inclined to give them full honors, and this involves your honor guard and involves all of the ceremonies and protocols that we give line of duty deaths. And I would certainly urge not to take those full steps. We want to be careful about glorifying any type of suicide, but at the same time, that agency may feel very strongly that, we need a level here that really shows our appreciation for this individual. I think one of the best recommendations that comes out of the guide, and this came from a couple of guys that we work with at the Memorial Fund, and as everybody knows, every year we put on the National Candlelight Vigil, and through that we have contact with a great number of honor guards. And so some of these guys are experts at handling these things, and they have great insights on what some of the best ways to cope with some of the more difficult decisions that an agency might have to come up with, how to cope with those decisions. But one of the important things that they recommend was to ask yourself these hard questions about the individual. Is this an individual who is under indictment or under investigation or is pending termination? Did the actions that this individual take harm anyone else or put anyone else in danger? So there is a list of questions in the guide, and I don't want to go through them all now, but I think you get the idea, where you want to evaluate and ask these really difficult questions, because you've got your agency to deal with, you have the family to deal with, there's often can be politics involved. So you really have to consider all of those difficult questions when you're deciding on how to honor this individual.
And Nick, if right there,
recommendation. Go ahead, John.
You covered a couple of things that kind of follow back to where we started from, the plan, right? We got to have a plan. That's number one. Number two, that death care packet, my agency had one of those as well. And when you get into these funerals and playing for these funerals and involving the family, how much emotion is there, Nick? And you're dealing with the line of duty. How much emotion is involved in these?
I think it's very high. And I mean, that sort of goes without saying, it's a death. But I think for an agency, and as the chief mentioned earlier, that could really unsettle an agency. Line of duty deaths, I think, in my experience, 26 years on in a major metropolitan police department, you have an experienced line of duty deaths and you're sort of prepared for that. You can understand it to some degree. But when someone takes their own life, particularly if you're close to them or you work close to them, I think there are a tremendous amount of emotions that run the gamut from survivor's guilt to just plain old, just your own emotions about that particular event that can be very unsettling. So I think it's something that really has to be managed.
And I want to continue forward with what Eric said, is the fact that families are going to question the event, right? And Eric did a great job kind of explaining how to get all your I's dotted and T's crossed so you can answer the questions they're going to have. Now we come to those funeral considerations. I can only imagine, I want this, she wants that, he wants this. So that death care packet, and again, my agency used it, you get the chance, as macabre as you said it was, you get to hear from the officer themselves about what their wishes were. Isn't that important?
And I think that's critical. And as I mentioned before, the family and it's been said, it's not about you. And it's not about the agency. There are some sensitivities that have to be managed. Mm-hmm. However, if that death care packet is there and you're respecting the family's wishes, and as the chief said, and you said, you only get one shot at this. So if you have a guide, you have something to help you prepare, and you're able to work with the family and let them know what is available, because many times these families have no idea. They don't, if it's a line of duty death, which I've experienced and worked with families on, they don't understand. They're going to get a flag. They're going to have taps. They're going to have all of these things that the honor guard will do in the ceremony of honoring that life. And you as a chief and together with the family need to come up with the best plan possible for how you're going to honor that. Of course, that, again, I think has to meet with where you are as an agency. And the one, I think the best piece of advice that comes out of this is when you have an event like this, a great way to treat it is if that member who is an active duty member, say they were killed in a car crash or suffered an illness, how would your agency, or they're a retiree, the chief mentioned retirees, what is your protocol? So if you were to do a sort of modified honor guard and service to honor that individual, I think that's entirely appropriate. And I think that's one of the strongest recommendations that we have to make in terms of you thinking about how you as an agency, along with the family, want to approach this funeral and the honor guard duties.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And again, going back to the fact is that this guide goes right to the executive, and you talked about this list of questions you have to ask. These are not easy questions. All right, they're going to be difficult questions, but you have to understand the context of what's going on here. All right, so at the end of the day, the guide will give you questions that you have to ask yourself. Going back to remembering it's not about you, it's about your agency and the loss of an officer and the officer's family. That's the most important thing, and how you keep that within that scope of how we want to honor that life. And I think that's important. I think that's real important. And Nick, again, with the honor guards too, right? You get requests for the honor guards all the time. And again, let's go back and make sure we understand that honor guard is not automatic, right?
It's not. No, it's not. I mean, if you're a retiree who died after years of honorable service in my agency, you're entitled to have an honor guard at your service if it's local. And I think for officers or detectives in my agency, again, I'll speak from my own experience. We had some guys who died not as a result of line of duty things, as I mentioned, a car crash, and some had illnesses and things. They were afforded some of the honors of a police funeral. And there are decisions to be made with regard to the officer may want to be buried in their uniform. The family may want specific things that they expect that you may say, yeah, no, we can't really offer you that. Again, it's asking those hard questions, but it starts with the family. And I think that death care packet, or at least having some of that information available to you, will help inform how you're going to proceed.
Yeah, and I agree. Have a plan. I just want to show this next a piece of the book that we took out of the book, and there was a quote that I took from the book from one of your people, and it says, "We have to temper the grief with awe, but temper the honors with common sense." I think that sums it up nicely, don't you?
It does, and it really tells you sort of how to approach this whole thing.
Yeah, and I love that quote. And again, not being about you, but that's important. We have a lost life here, and we have to honor that. There's questions we have to ask before we do those honors. And Nick, thanks a lot for that. Thank you so much. At the end of the day, too, moving on from here, we've got the scene done. We have the funerals done, and a lot of people think, the minute the funeral's done, it's over. Okay, now we're going to go back and revisit the concept of postvention. How do we move forward? And I'm going to bring Julie on for that. And Julie, we've had this conversation about how do you do this, how to make this happen. But this postvention is very important at this point in time, isn't it?
It's so important to have the right response as an agency. You're hopefully going to be providing the families with some support so get help in the community, but you also have your entire agency to figure out who's the most impacted, who might have looked up to this person that you might never know, and who might themselves be at risk for suicide because of this great loss. And so part of that, I think, as you guys were talking about, starts at the funeral. That unless this person was really disgraced and under investigation, that you want to honor their life and not the last minutes of their life, not how they died. And that conveys a message to the entire community. Also having resources available. So again, like everything we've been talking about, it's all about planning. Does your agency have an in-house person that you work with, or an EAP, or community resources that everybody knows is available for trauma or grief or loss? And really knowing that plan and figuring out how you're going to convey to that, and helping people get the support they need, helping them. Officers aren't always the most open to help seeking. So helping them understand that it's completely natural to have all these questions when a suicide occurs. We know that on average, officers visit a lot of suicide scenes. In our work, we found that over the course of their career, officers had been to about 30 scenes. That's a lot of trauma just from suicide. But when it's a fellow officer, that really tends to stick with a lot of people. And so that leads to re-experiencing or nightmares, or really having those whys. What could I have done? What could I have said? How could I have prevented it? Kinds of moments that people really need to process themselves, but also sometimes need professional help or a group where they can really talk through this grief and figure out how they can get back to a place where they're at the best of being able to function.
And the other thing I want to talk about today is there's a couple of things that if you didn't know, you wouldn't know, right? This support in the beginning has to be focused, right? There's that focused short-term support you have to provide, which is that raw emotional time when a lot's going on. And I think that's one piece we have to have planned up ahead of time. The second piece, and Julie, you and I have talked about this before, and I'm going to introduce a new concept to the group, the concept of suicide contagion, which kind of goes to play with the scene, and it also works with how we do the funeral and then the aftermath. Can you talk about the concept of what we mean by a suicide contagion?
Yeah, definitely. We know that being close to someone who's died by suicide is a risk factor for someone to die by suicide themselves or to start thinking about suicide. It's actually fairly common for people who have lost loved ones to have thoughts of suicide, but then they're more likely to actually act on those thoughts. So even though they've experienced this worst loss imaginable, it puts them at more risk. Kind of that idea, we had a veteran in one of our studies who said, you know, it kind of put that idea in my head. If I couldn't cope, how could I possibly cope? And so contagion is a risk and something to think about, because when one suicide occurs, sometimes there's 2 or 3 that occur in rapid succession of people that were close to the person that died or the person that knew them. And so in order to kind of combat that contagion, it's important to be able to get people that are in need of help, the help they need. It's important to, as we were talking about in the funerals, not glorify the person who died or glorify their suicide. That moment doesn't define them. And just because they died by suicide doesn't mean necessarily they're a better or worse officer than somebody who hasn't. And so treating the death just like any other death that was sudden and unexpected is important in the way we talk about it. Talking about their characteristics and not just the suicide is also important. And then making sure that it doesn't become, as the SAFLEO guide talks about, one of those moments that leads to more death. And so this postvention becomes intervention. In the SAFLEO trainings, the concept is left bang. So the idea that something could be done before there's another death is really important for postvention.
Yeah, and that's focusing on the prevention. The other thing we talk about providing these services. Now, a lot of agencies will come up and say, hey, we have VAP, so we're good. Or we're going to offer you this 24-hour helpline, or we're going to bring in this temporary peer support. Now, I'm a cop, right? I bleed blue. And now we'll talk about this for a second. One size does not fit all, does it, when it comes to support? What does that have to look like? It can't be you must do A, B, and C, because that's never going to work, is it?
Right. Mandating people to get treatment typically doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the culture of the agency, an in-house clinician or an EAP also might not work, because people know you're going to the EAP, or they know that you're going to the shrink in the department. And so making sure that whatever your agency has in place for everyone, that there's a range of services and that it can meet people's needs, not just right after an event, but sometimes the hardest part is the first anniversary. You're coming up on Super Bowl again, and that suicide was right at Super Bowl, and all of a sudden it brings everybody right back to that moment. And so it's important to think through those. Is it holidays? Is it graduations? Is it the next class coming in from the academy? And things that might be kind of a natural ebb and flow in your agency that might bring it up for people. And so making people aware those anniversaries or those times of year might be much more difficult, Or also what we've heard is responding to other similar events. So if it's a suicide of someone the same age or the same street, that can sometimes be difficult as well for people.
So yeah, and that's important to remember, and that's part of that long-term assistance, right? You have to understand that there are going to be anniversary dates that have a major impact on the agency, specific people, and we have to be aware of that. And as an executive, we put it in the guide, you need to pay attention to those anniversary dates, because that's all part of what we call this post-traumatic growth. Another term I want to introduce. When we talk about post-traumatic growth, listen, we now deal with trauma, right? Cops deal with trauma all the time, but the trauma we deal with most of the time is very visible, right? This kind of trauma that we're talking about is invisible to a certain extent. So when we talk about post-traumatic growth, what is that process of going to get post-traumatic growth following an officer suicide?
Post-traumatic growth is this really interesting concept where people who've gone through these horrible traumas can end up in a better place than they would have ever been in their lives. And the reason that happens is because it shatters part of their world. So it shatters their assumptions about their job or about their religion or about what they need to be doing in their life. And so for some people, what that does is it makes them change the course of their life. So it might make them leave their police job and go and get a psychology degree because they really want to help people who've been through similar losses. And so it's important to understand that this event, even for somebody who doesn't seem like they were close to the person that died, might really make them think through everything in their lives and make a big change. And for an agency, it can be something that can be embraced because it brings us down to have these horrible, awful events and times, but it's also a time when people come together and can come out of it much stronger. But it requires some guidance and some people being willing to grow and to understand that things are never going to be the same.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, and it's part of, and can be part of your prevention, right? Because the fact that you talk about it and you let people get the services they need. So post-traumatic growth is could be part of a prevention for a next potential suicide, correct?
Exactly. And having that guide in place to understand that this might happen, that people might fundamentally change having gone through this event, even though they've been to 100 suicide scenes before, it's different when they find the captain in his office.
Yeah. So that takes us to another thing, lessons learned, right? I'm a trainer. I also work on the VALOR Officer Safety and Wellness Program. And one of the things we do a lot of time is we do data dives. We look what the science says, and we come up and use a lot of lessons learned to prevent officers from being injured in the line of duty, preventing them having motor vehicle accidents, increase their health. When it comes to this, lessons learned, this is a little more difficult because it's so raw. But we talked, and your agencies it kind of taking the lead on this concept of psychological autopsies. And that's a strong term because an autopsy where I come from is much different than what we're about to talk about. So if you can talk about psychological autopsies and how they work.
Psychological autopsies are a very structured event where someone who is trained in the protocol goes through and interviews multiple sources about the minutes, days, and hours before the suicide to really minutes, hours, and days before the suicide to really figure out, if we put all the pieces together, what is it that we missed? And that involves talking to those people and going through that structured guide. It's also a really nice opportunity to figure out how people are doing and what kind of resources for those left behind are they not getting. But what a psychological autopsy can do in an agency is really figure out where are those stress points. If everybody had all of the information before that suicide occurred, perhaps it could have been prevented. Now we know we're not going to prevent this one. This person's unfortunately already dead, but maybe it might be the next time. It might be that the coverage at certain days of the week isn't there if there's a major incident. It might be that people that are going through a divorce aren't getting the kind of help that they need. Things like that really, when you look at what happened at one, it might really apply to other people in the agency. It becomes postvention because you're helping those who are still left behind and hopefully preventing future suicides.
Yeah, and what we're looking for is common denominators, right? We're looking for things that are the same, things that are similar that we have to pick up on that gives us a better chance at the prevention piece, aren't we?
Precisely.
And let's talk about this whole process now. A lot of agencies are out there saying, wait a minute, a psychological autopsy. We're not trained to do that. First and foremost, when do these occur? This is not the day after the suicide, correct?
Right. Usually these occur a couple months after the event, giving people enough time so that you're not interrogating someone who is grieving and really feeling the pain, because you don't need all the answers right away in this situation.
And you're also not going to turn and look at your detective bureau and say, okay, who's got the least amount of seniority? Guess what you're doing, right? No, who should be doing this?
Yeah. Psychoautopsy is someone who is trained in this protocol. Usually it's a mental health person, but not necessarily. It's somebody who's gone through the training. There's general psychoautopsy training, and then there's some specific protocols specifically for law enforcement that have been developed. But typically people go through the training and certification process before they are able to do it. Sometimes that's within an agency. Bigger agencies have people trained up on psychoautopsy and go through the training. In other agencies, they rely on the community and contract out with people in the community who are trained.
Yeah, it just makes sense. Again, lessons learned, trying to find out solutions. The causality, correlation is the best part. It's really great comics. What I want to do now is move on to what we call the recommendations and considerations, a recap of everything we talked about today. So if we can bring up the whole panel on the screen, let's get kind of a recap on everything we talked about today, and Shimon personal insight. And Chief, I'm going to start with you because you're still there, right? This is in the back of your head constantly. If there's one thing that you can say to an executive officer, a chief, a sheriff, somebody in the field, if you can have them in front of you right now, what would you say to them as far as this concept of this post-response guide? What would you say to them?
I would say start now with your prevention efforts so you never need to use it.
There has to be a plan.
But yeah, there has to be a plan. You have to have a plan in place. Should it get to this point? But and everybody has said it in this conversation today. The ultimate goal is to never need this, and that starts with an organization being willing to have these conversations. That starts with an organization understanding that there are people struggling with divorces, there are people struggling with financial issues, or anything that could be that could lead to this, and providing an avenue, providing the resources that folks that are struggling right now need to deal with those on the front end will pay dividends by hopefully never having to use this guide.
And I think what you're saying is the best postvention is a good prevention, right?
Absolutely.
Focus on that. Nick, your work with the memorial. I know that you talked many times about the fact that you're one of the many people who guards that wall, and you take that very seriously. And we want to honor as many officers as humanly possible. But for recommendations for you now, getting a chief who gets involved in this, what are your words of wisdom to that chief as well?
Well, I think it's been said, and I think the way to, and that essentially is to have that plan and to ask yourself these questions now. And I think everyone here on the panel has said that. The way I approach this, though, and it's tied into the officer safety and wellness work that we do at the Memorial Fund, that is, and I think the chief said it as well, it's a cultural change. We're gonna, we talk about, and I think we mentioned the stigma that exists within law enforcement to asking for help. And this goes hand in hand with that, to open yourself up, to have these difficult conversations, but to really embrace this idea that this could happen and be prepared, and that this is a cultural shift, I think, throughout all of law enforcement in the United States. Not only just towards greater safety and trying to get cops to wear their seatbelts, but to really to open it up to where it's okay not to be okay, to have mechanisms in place to support people who are having mental and emotional issues. But that also ties into, I mean, if they're having financial problems, if they're having marital problems, which was mentioned. So for me to say to the chiefs is, make sure your mind is open to addressing these issues and removing that stigma. And I think, and of course, this guide itself will help you if ever you should need it. Hopefully you won't.
Eric, you want to add to that?
Yeah, those are all great points, Nick. I so appreciate you saying that. And the only thing I would add to that is to shift that culture, to start that process. One, it takes leadership at the top, but two, it takes starting that process right from the onboarding through their academy training.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And really allowing your new recruits to understand that this is the culture within this organization, and being okay with asking for help, and understanding that the doc is going to be there, or understanding that those services are available to you. Starting that early will be really important.
And
Yeah,
I think
Julie.
that help seeking isn't weakness.
Right.
That it actually can make you a better officer, a better human being, a better spouse, and that everyone that reaches out to get help, hopefully, if they are successful at it, they're still alive, and we won't have to use these kinds of postvention guides for suicides.
And Julie, staying with that, again, giving you the same opportunity to speak with the chief, how do you break the stigma? What would be your recommendation to a chief right now, based on what you do and what you know? What would you tell a chief? How do you break that stigma?
I think it's important to have these conversations and to recognize that, unfortunately, we still lose a lot of officers to suicide. And so that leaves lots of departments across the country having these kinds of decisions to make about what do we do afterwards, and really changing this culture can hopefully decrease suicides in the future.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the biggest comments I could give is you have to model the way. I tried to do that when I was a chief. Deputy Chief, you're still there right now. Would you agree with me? You have to model the way.
There's no question about it. That like I said, that starts from the top, and the leadership really setting that expectation and that culture.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, listen, we covered a lot of information in a very short period of time, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk about it. There's a reason why we picked you to be contributors and reviewers of this guide. I hope that the people watching this workshop understand that. We also want to offer some other resources that they can have. First and foremost, we have the National Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers website, the web portal. I'm telling anybody listening today, take the time to go visit our web page. Please go take a look, see what's there. There's a lot of information and resources on not only this topic, which will be the guide itself, but other topics that you can use for your prevention plans inside of your agency. All the stuff that you're seeing on the screen right now will be provided to you at no cost. These are BJA programs that are funded by the BJA, and they're provided to you at no cost. So please, 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 just don't let this be the final time you talk about this topic. Please invest in your agency. Please invest in new people. Please invest in yourself, and do the homework now, and make sure that you have that plan that we talked about so many times today, that strategic and plan in place, just in case you need it. And more importantly, as we move to the SAFLEO program, to have a plan for prevention and make suicide awareness a part of your culture every single day. Now, I want to thank the BJA and, of course, the Suicide Awareness for Law Enforcement Officers program, also the American Association for Suicidology, the Major City Chiefs Association, the National Law Enforcement Officers Museum and Memorial, and, of course, IR, the company that I work for, who will present this. That being said, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here. I want to thank our panel. And I just want to leave you with this. Please be safe. Please be well. And please lead. That's what you've been tasked to do. Lead your agencies. Be a catalyst for change. Become the solution to this problem that we face in law enforcement every day. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.